Patience. Okay. I know I'm late. It's just because I had to email someone because they lost their wallet. And I'm like, I could email them after class, but I figured the panic attack that's going on right now, it's probably worth me taking 2 seconds to email someone and be like, hey, just so you know, I have your wallet. Let's meet up and we will, I will give it to you. I promise. Okay. That is echoey still. All right. Welcome back. Hello. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you had a good reading week. Didn't you already get feedback on your midterms?
We got our midterms, but I don't know.
Will you be getting feedback? Okay. If you want feedback, yes. Well, there's 130 of you. So I don't write out individual feedback. If you want, book an appointment with me. I will go over it with you in like painstaking detail. No, I don't mark comments, but everything that I like, that marks that you lost and all that stuff, I'm more than happy to go over it with you. But in order to protect my questions and stuff, we have to do it in person. So you have to ask me. And honestly, like one of my rookie instructor mistakes when I was starting teaching was giving feedback to everyone on everything and then realizing through analytics that a large number of people never read the feedback anyway. And a lot of what you do is wasting your time. I remember one time I had an essay and a student, and I think there were 2 essays in the course. And on the second essay, you got a pretty mid mark on the first one and a pretty bad mark on the second one. And he's like, well, what did I do wrong on the second essay? Well, I'm like, you didn't take into account any of my feedback on the first essay. And he's like, oh, I didn't read it. I was like, okay, I see what's happening. And this is sadly more normal than you'd think. But okay, if you want, right, use the appointment booking link on, and I know a lot of you already have, on Canvas to book an appointment with me. And I'm more than happy to, yes. Yes, yeah, that's it. Or we can do it online. There's a choice on the link. Once you choose a time, it's like, do you want to do online or do you want to do in person? You can pick which one you want to do. Sometimes I do my appointments up on the 4th floor in my other office, but I'll generally email people that are on the list that day to tell them where I'm going to be if I'm not in the Center for Criminological Research and all of that stuff. But yeah, you just show up, or if you want online, you do it through Google Meet. It auto-generates a Google Meet link, so all good. Do I promise to be there? Guys, I'm always here. Yes, that's why it books in my calendar, because one of the things that I used to do was book appointments with students through email and then forget about them and then not show up, and that was bad. And then sometimes you have to lie and be like, oh, sorry, something came up. But now, because what I do in the van on my Android Auto in the morning is I look and I'm like, oh, I have 3 appointments today, and now I know. So there you go. Everything is auto in my calendar. Or it could be like today, where I had 3 appointments and 2 people canceled. So, there you go. Someone had a panic attack and then booked an appointment and then decided they didn't want an appointment anymore. Okay. Good times. Let's do it. Maybe. I do promise, if you book an appointment, I will be there. And if I can't be there, I will email you and tell you, I'm sorry, I can't be there. Let's do online. It'll be fine. We'll be good. Was this the slide I was on? I can't remember what slide. On Friday, like before reading break. Okay, it was this one. Suffocation model of marriage. I meant to review, and then I got hung up with something, and I didn't get a chance to look at where I was. All right, so let's talk. So we're talking about marriage, right? Oh yeah, let's go back a couple of slides here. So we're talking specifically about shifts in marriage, right, that Rigneris is talking about in his book, The Future of Christian Marriage. Most specifically, the shift to this capstone model of marriage away from a foundational model of marriage, right? Where now young people tend to consider marriage as something that you essentially tack on to an already sort of built out young adult life, where you've got, career, housing, car, all the accoutrements of adulthood, and then, onto that you tack on a partner and then eventually children, right? So, I actually think we ended off with this quote, that typically, this makes sense to me now. One of the things that people did in hard economic times was delay marriage and childbearing, and today, driven by lifestyle expectations and material expectations, people want those material needs met, and especially, women are more insistent that those material needs or those lifestyle kind of expectations not decline even when children come along. So they're looking for, and I think I made this joke last time, so this is now all making sense to me because I know my own jokes and how I make them all the time, right? It's they want the 6 foot, blue eyes, trust fund, right? This is I know that not all women are like this, just the ones on TikTok, right? But this is, kind of the joke, right? The material kind of expectations out of a potential partner have gone up. Okay. So I think I left this off here. So the other thing that's going on, and this is, a kind of long-standing theme for Mark Ramirez, right? He talked about it in one of his other books, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the course, which is called, the book is called you again, right at the bottom, Cheap Sex. It's an interesting book. Again, we'll discuss it a little bit later. Okay, so historically, right, if we look at a whole bunch of historical sociological data, economic stability, right, periods where men are doing pretty good, have prompted men to generally pursue marriage, right? Okay, so what this has led a lot of economists and sociologists to sort of postulate is that one of the things that has been driving down the marriage rate for a long time has been a decline in economic stability for men, right? However, there's some evidence against this, right? And very specifically, this paper, Schneider, Harkneet, and Stimson, which Ramirez cites, right, suggests that based on economic data, the decline in economic stability for men, and there has been a marked decline, only explains probably about 20% of the drop in marriages. And he cites this other study from Litcher, Price, and Swigert that asked what economic levels would move women from being unmarried to married. And it estimated that men's income would have to rise by 55%, right? So quite a significant rise. And their employment levels would have to rise by 26%. So what this means, right? Far more men today are considered unmarriageable to both careerist women and undereducated working women, right? So, amongst the things, right, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about, education. Women in general are doing much better, right, than they have historically. Now, we have to recognize that obviously they come from a point of relative disadvantage historically. But if we look at the kind of trajectory of women, really since the 1970s, it's been a pretty quick ascent, right? They're taking over a lot of very high skilled, very high impact and high status professions. They're becoming more and more educated, and men are kind of falling behind. But it's not just, educated women that don't see men as, particularly good bets. It's also, so we have our educated careerist women who are seeing a lot more men as unmarriageable because they, don't have the kind of careers that would allow them to support their lifestyles even once children come along. But even undereducated working class women increasingly think the same thing, right? And this kind of holds true of everybody, right? In both kind of categories, both working class and white collar professions, men's incomes would have to rise considerably and their employment levels would have to rise considerably to move a lot of men into the marriageable categories. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting one. It's not just that, however. And I'll talk about a few things, and I guess we'll end off with this point on this slide. But it's worth considering that increasingly it kind of looks like men are also less interested in getting married, and we'll dig into why that is. All right, so one thing. When you have that marriageable part of the marriage market, right? Today, marriageable men are outnumbered. We don't have an exact ratio, but think of it probably somewhere around 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 in that portion of the market by women, right? So for every one marriageable man, there's somewhere like 3 or 4 women who are looking for a marriageable partner, right? Someone who, meets their economic needs, meets their kind of expectations of what a partner should be. So for Rigneris, what this means, we're going to go back to the highlighter, that men have more power and more time to navigate their way to marriage on their terms. Okay, now this is, kind of for 2 reasons. One is obviously, that there's fewer of them, right? So it's a supply and demand issue. The supply is low, the demand is high. So they can command, in a sense, if you want to put it in crude market terms, and Mark likes to do this, put a lot of relationship dynamics in market terms, right? They can command a higher price, right? So, and they can, sort of be choosy about what they want in the marriage market. The other thing, though, is they have more time. While men aren't completely unconstrained in terms of the marriage market, in terms of time, right? Men have a broader window of fertility than women do in general, right? It's much more, it's much more possible for men, say in their late 30s and 40s, to father children than it is for women in those same age categories to get pregnant. So men have a little bit more time. They're not sort of fighting a ticking clock of biology as much. There are, fertility concerns as you get older as a male, but they're not as prominent. So they have more time, right? And they definitely have more power to navigate because, if you want to consider, good guys who are marriageable a scarce good, they're kind of a scarce good at this point. Okay. Certain natural experiments have pointed this out. And if you know me, I love this natural experiment because I talk about it all the time in different classes for different reasons. But one of them they cite, and here Rigneris, and it's always nice when parts of the course naturally connect to each other, because in a few slides forward, we're going to talk about Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege. But he cites Melissa Kearney and Wilson, her longtime collaborator, and their look at what's called a natural experiment, right? So a natural experiment, if you remember this from methods, is one of these kind of circumstances where the normal sociological environment sets up a certain kind of dynamic, right? In this case, a population that is affected by some kind of changing social condition that isn't present in the rest of the population, right? So here, North Dakota experienced an economic boom where the rest of the United States didn't. And it's really interesting to see then what changed in North Dakota. Okay, so let's talk about the natural experiment that happened in North Dakota, generally referred to as the North Dakota fracking boom, right? So if you don't know what fracking is, I'll explain it very quickly. But basically, fracking is a way of getting oil and gas out of rock formations, where basically you pump a bunch of high pressure water and chemicals into a rock formation, usually made of shale, to crack it and release the oil and gas that's in there, and use the fluid to push which is lighter than oil, heavier than oil, to push the oil and gas out of a well, right? And this has proven a very, very productive and very profitable kind of industry. And North Dakota was one of the places that this was sort of pioneered. And they went through a 6-year kind of economic boom when fracking really hit the market. So what happened in North Dakota? Well, for one thing, the employment rate for men, especially working class men, went up considerably, right? Because all of a sudden you had a labor imbalance. You had an industry that needed a lot of workers and didn't have a lot. So all of a sudden there was a whole bunch of new jobs being created, more than the market could fill. So workers were in really, really high demand. It's somewhat of a dangerous job because you're working on oil rigs with high pressure chemicals, and it's dirty and kind of awful, and the rates of cancer are really, really high. So as a corresponding measure, you get paid really well for, fracking. So lots of men enjoyed financial success in North Dakota because of the boom in the demand for labor. Now, what's interesting is it sort of went against the expectation that and the historical norm that when economic well-being increases for men, so does marriage, right? So that didn't happen in North Dakota. It did raise the birth rate in both marital and non-marital births. So both married couples and non-married couples both had more children, right? Because they felt they could afford it. But it didn't increase the marriage rate at all. And what Kearney and Wilson suggest or state is that this contrasts with earlier economic booms that were kind of similar. And here they point to similar kind of resource booms that happened in Appalachia, so places like Ohio, Kentucky, the places J.D. Vance is from, the hillbilly country, if you will. You had coal booms in Appalachia in the 70s and 80s. And in the 70s and 80s, what happened? Male employment went up, and so did the marriage rate, right? And their income, their wealth surged, and there was a surge in marriage that corresponded. So what Rigneris asks is, what has changed? Are men losing the motivation to marry? And he essentially answers this in the affirmative, right? That one of the things that has historically driven men to want to get married has clearly changed. And so the answer, in a sense, to what's changed is more culture than it is economics, right? Or at least not entirely economics. Okay. Yeah, other examples, right, that he cites. Dorn and Hansen, 2018, found that declines in male-dominated industries deterred the formation of marriages in America, right? So again, male-dominated industries like manufacturing led to more men being unmarriageable. Declines in female-intensive employment had the opposite effect, right? So if an industry that's dominated by women declines, it actually raises the marriage rate, not significantly, but in a statistically significant way, right? So it's not like a 90% boom in marriages, but it's a big enough increase that it's noticeable. And yeah, marriage rates decline when the likelihood of women out-earning men rises, right? And this is actually a really, as I've sort of dug into more and more kind of research on this is a really interestingly robust kind of economics and sociological finding that, higher median female wages decreases a bunch of things, marriage rates and fertility rates. Both of them kind of go down when women are doing better economically, and they go up a little bit when kind of female economic outlooks decline a bit. So that is interesting. Okay, this is a really, really long quote, but let's break it down a little bit. We'll do so with highlighters because it's fun. All right, so speaking specifically about poor and working class women, right? He says it's not that poor and working class women don't like the idea of marriage or the notion of an exchange relationship in marriage, right? Which in a lot of ways is what marriage is, right? It's an exchange relationship where both partners are offering something to the other. We'll talk about what that is in a second. However, it is at its core a social exchange relationship, which I know makes it sound super romantic, but sociologists are always really good at making romantic or lovely things sound boring and drab. So more of that. In fact, they are more apt to endorse both, right, marriage and a notion of exchange, than our middle and upper classes. Here I'm going to put, I don't know why, I'm going to put this in like a really funky color. Green. Not that this is good. They simply do not see how the men in their life will live up to it. So they hedge their bets, waiting, cohabiting, having children, with few great expectations for a lifelong mate. Okay, so basically what Rigneris is saying is, poor and working class women, like the idea of marriage. They like the idea of getting something out of marriage, right? A kind of exchange, financial security, a partner to help them, right? A lifelong partner, all of those things. They just don't think the men in their lives are marriageable, right? They think the men in their lives kind of suck, and they're not going to live up to these promises. So, they still want things like children, so they cohabit, right? But they don't want to tie themselves in too tightly. They have children, but not with the great expectations that these men are going to be around forever, right? And then, he says this is even more tragic for these communities than it first appears. And we'll go to highlighting in red, which probably doesn't work that well. When a child's parents aren't married, even if they are living together, that child is automatically at increased risk for a heap of negative outcomes like drug use, delinquent behaviors, domestic violence, parental breakup, right? So all kind of negative things are increased by not marrying, right? And those risks are inherent. Those risks to the inherent frailty of life and poverty, they add those risks to the inherent frailty of life and poverty, and it's no surprise that this continues, right? So for the working class and the poor, they would benefit from this relationship, but especially for women, they don't think the men in these communities can live up to these expectations of marriage. Okay, so off the depressing stuff to something else for a moment. So what Rigneris talks about next is what he calls the observed model of marriage. So what is the norm, right? What do people expect that marriage is going to be? Well, basically, the kind of standard model of marriage that people have is the four following points, right? So it is, number one, a comprehensive union exhibiting totality, right? So it is a sharing of minds, wills, actions, and resources. It means holding nothing back. Maybe we'll highlight that, right? So it's supposed to be a sort of like, you're in it together kind of relationship, holding nothing back. Okay. Generally speaking, most couples who marry, I know it's becoming increasingly popular to be like child-free and stuff, but the norm remains that most people who marry anticipate having children, right? At least one. People expect, or at least desire, marriage to be permanent, right? Nobody gets into a marriage, hopefully, with the expectation this is a temporary thing. There's a lot of friction to breaking up a marriage, so you probably don't want to, break it up, and people don't consider that the norm. And fidelity, right? Sexual fidelity is expected. And for all those New York Times articles that come out every now and then that talk about like polycules and, couples that are in open marriages, generally speaking, from a sociological perspective, those types of relationships do not work out in the long term. Infidelity, he says, even if agreed upon, carries an expiration date for the relationship, right? So generally speaking, it doesn't kind of work out for couples to even agree to see other people or be, sexually active with partners outside of the marriage relationship. The norm, and it is a deeply held cultural and social norm around marriage, remains fidelity. Okay. So sorry. So what's the cost, right? And again, this is put in kind of crudely economic terms. But you can think of marriage as an exchange relationship, right? And, like I said, Mark wrote this book called Cheap Sex. And the whole premise of the book, and it is a fascinating book, despite the fact that a lot of sociologists don't like it, which I think inherently, because I have this odd personality, that when people like something, I automatically don't like it, and when people don't like something, I automatically like it. I can't explain why that is. I still haven't watched The Wire, even though all my TV junkie friends are like, The Wire is the greatest show ever. Baltimore is one of the characters. I'm like, I don't care. You're pretentious, and I don't want to talk to you. Right? And so I've always liked Mark's work because, every time his work comes out, Stephen Cohen especially, who is another sociologist, writes a negative review of it just because he hates Mark. And that, for some reason, makes me kind of like it. All right, so in economic terms, economically speaking, women have what men want. And this is, again, has typically been access to sex, right? Shall we say, relatively simple, relatively friction-free access to a female's body, right? A woman's body, typically in this case, one woman's body. And the idea is that marriage is a trade, right? Men promise, kind of support, care for children, to stick around, to be good partners, and all of that in exchange for, basically a pretty reliable access to sex, right? And, I didn't pick this image for nothing, and it's not auto-generated by AI, right? And I know this is not all men want, but in large part, right, sex is something that motivates men very, very highly. So, historically, right, this has meant a bunch of promises, right? And here, and we'll talk about this again a little bit later when we talk about sex and intimacy, but historically, sex has been very expensive for men. Because in order to have sex, and I mean, sex inherently very risky for women in some ways, right? Especially prior to contraception, where children come along and that woman is tied down to that child in really, really substantial ways, right? So it's risky for women. So sex and getting sex involved promises and commitments, right? Which was codified and put into structural form in the form of marriage. However, increasingly what we have is an environment where, I was going to put red, but I want to make it seem like this is good and bad. I want to be more neutral than that, so I'm going to put this in yellow, but it is different. Sex increasingly is cheap, right? In the sense that following the sexual revolution, women expect less from men in exchange for sex. We're going to talk, when we talk about sex and intimacy, about hookup culture in particular. We'll talk about pornography as well, because they are both forms of cheap sex, right? Where basically little commitment and little cost is demanded from people in order to access sex. And inevitably, these systems tend to favor men in pretty substantial ways. Okay, so if sex is easy, it's cheap. Now, one of the things that Mark will say is that, among the phenomenon that we're seeing increasingly is a lot more men who, you might call them incels, right? But men who are having more and more difficulty getting sex, right? In terms of with an actual human partner. Porn doesn't count in this sense. And some people have argued, well, doesn't that mean sex is actually really expensive? And he says no, because there is some cadre of men, right? Those that fall into that 6 foot, works out, blue eyes, trust fund kind of category, that access probably a disproportionate number of partners at very little cost to themselves. So for them, sex is cheap. For everyone else, sex is impossible, I guess. Okay. The other thing is, if we talk about access to pornography, which he calls the cheapest form of sex, Obviously the internet has made sex in that regard very, very cheap, right? Essentially free, and in quantities that would stupefy the mind of even your recent ancestors. Okay. I wanted to go back and see if there's any questions. Historically and culturally, a dowry sweetens the deal. Yes. I don't know. Maybe? I can never remember how common dowries were. All right. So, right. I have to check the time, and I have to remember it's on top of the eye of Sauron staring at me. All right. So, how cheap sex slows marriage? Okay. Blue. We'll go with blue this time. So, and I love this, right? Because you want to find like articles like this. They are a dime a dozen on the internet. Is he stringing me along? 9 ways to tell, right? Okay, so men in general, and I don't want to be like biologically determinist about this, but there's really strong kind of psychological and sociological evidence for this point. Men on the whole naturally seem to want greater sexual variety, right? And this seems to be kind of deeply born into our species essence, right? And it kind of makes sense. Again, the cost for men of spreading it around is lower than it is for women. So, if available, men tend to take advantage of more access to more sexual partners. Okay. So, again, marriage-minded women tend to outnumber marriage-minded men. So, there's more women who would be open and interested in marriage than there are men, and there are certainly more marriageable women today than there are marriageable men. So, it's harder for women to demand commitment from men. Why? Because it's pretty easy for a marriageable man to simply move on to another woman, right? So again, for every like one marriageable man, you have somewhere between 3 or 4 marriageable women, right? And so, essentially, you have a pretty skewed ratio, which gives men a lot of power to demand sex earlier in relationships. And again, there's lots of sociological evidence that suggests that if they felt like they had a choice, women would tend to want to have sex much later in a relationship than they do. It's something like 2 to 3 months into a relationship, but it's often, just a few weeks into relationships in a lot of cases. So men have kind of disproportionate power and are relatively kind of able to leave relationships and find other partners if they're in that category of attractive marriageable men. So what? Many men will string women along, right? Being in a relationship with them, not committing, not getting into a committed kind of relationship for as long as possible. And I pulled this quote again from the book, and this is from Pavel from Krakow in Poland, right? So one of the sites that they did their interviewing in. He's Catholic, right? Pavel was married pretty young. He's Roman Catholic and a devout Roman Catholic, but he's sort of reflecting on his secular peers. And he said, I always joke to my secular friends, it's all about the cost of admission, right? So if women have a low cost of admission, they're going to get their hearts broken a lot, right? But if they have a high cost of admission, they might actually get to a meaningful relationship. It helps me feel like if your relationships have intimacy outside marriage, right? So he's very Catholic. Don't be shocked when you make it to like the 10th or 15th date or whatever, and the man is done with you, and it's like, oh, I guess that's it, right? And that, was one of the quotes that Rigneris used to kind of encapsulate this idea. I think that sort of makes sense, right? Men have a lot of, if they have a sense that there's a lot of sexual variety available to them, they're going to seek that out, which makes it much harder for women to get men to commit. Now, that's not to say men will never commit, right? There comes a time where men also want to commit. It just tends to be a little bit later than women. Okay. So, cohabitation. right? Living together. What Regnerus suggests, and I think this is, almost a sociological cliche at this point, cohabitation increasingly is seen as a safety hatch against early commitment and marital failure. But he says it plays more to men's advantages than it does to women's in a lot of cases. And again, down to our sort of like, no one wants to hear it, biological clock argument, right? Men retain for far longer than women the option to stay and form a family or leave and pair off with someone new. And there's been lots of, sort of attempts to quantify this. I've definitely seen people do kind of studies where they suggest that kind of women's peak attractiveness is at about 25 years old and men's is considerably later, right? Sort of more towards 35 once they've got their shit together, if you will. So, there's differences in, I guess if you want to put it again, kind of crudely, after 25, some of the sheen comes off and women become less attractive to partners than men, and men are becoming more attractive. So again, waiting longer tends to play to men's advantages more so than to women's, which is not good news if you want to find a partner. Okay. And this is again pretty robust in sociological studies. Women seldom say they'd rather cohabit than marry, unless they perceive cohabitation as a beneficial and reliable stepping stone to marriage. Or, and this again, if we consider a lot of men kind of unmarriageable, less risky than marriage given their ambivalence about the man they're entering into a relationship with, right? So again, there's a lot of ambivalence that men might not be able to live up to expectations, and so cohabitation can be a way of sort of testing that out, and seeing whether it kind of works out. Okay, now, generally speaking, cohabitation used to be a much worse arrangement than marriage in terms of stability, right? It was something like, if we go back to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the average cohabiting relationship lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 years, right? They didn't tend to be particularly stable. People who lived together, even people who lived together and then got married, tended to get divorced at much higher rates. This is still true to an extent, but the gap has closed significantly, where it's now, marriage is just a slightly better bet than cohabitation. So yeah, generally divorce rates are only slightly higher if people cohabit only with their future spouse. However, serial cohabitors, right? So if you live with several people prior to getting married, the rates nearly double those who didn't cohabit before marriage, rates of divorce. So, right, the more people you live with prior to getting married, the more likely you are to get divorced at the end of the day. Okay. Yay. I'm not suggesting anything. Okay, so how am I doing for time? I got 9 minutes, which is good. So I got 2 more units in the marriage topic. So what I want to move on to now, and we'll come back to some very economics data and Melissa Kearney after a brief detour into what I think is a truly fascinating sociological argument from a guy named Johann Kurtz. And I linked you the piece that he wrote. It's on Canvas called "It's Embarrassing to Be a Stay-at-Home Mom." And I think it's a really interesting argument. It mostly revolves around kind of fertility. And again, fertility and marriage are closely linked. And we're talking family, so fertility is there. But makes I think, a unique argument as to what potentially is driving the decline in fertility in the West and other parts of the world as well. So we're actually seeing it as a kind of global phenomenon. Okay, so I'm going to lay out this case as quickly as I can. I do think it's a really, really interesting one. And honestly, it was one of those things, and why I threw it in the course, because I read it and I had never considered this particular argument. And I think it's compelling in a lot of ways. Okay, So fertility is collapsing worldwide. And this is something that I've been saying for years, but is increasingly sort of in the zeitgeist. Not to cite him because I don't want to, but Elon Musk talks about this all the time. Not that he is the arbiter of all things that are smart. He just makes really ugly trucks. Thank you for that laugh. I appreciate it. I do hate the Cybertruck though. Okay, so fertility is collapsing worldwide, right? There's a few kind of, shall we say, bright spots in fertility. They're mostly in Africa and sort of Central Asia, but essentially, virtually every developed society in the world, and even now some developing countries are, experiencing drops in their fertility. Now, lots of explanations have been proffered. They usually revolve around things like economics, right, and housing. Those are the two really common ones. But declining religiosity, growth of contraception, and lack of available childcare are also things that have been suggested. But what Kurt suggests is none of these in their entirety fit the macro data. Okay, I mean, these are just some sustainable development goals. The UN Sustainable Development Goals advocate for general drops in fertility to alleviate poverty. But we see, right, like global fertility rate, 90 to 95 was about 3 children per woman. And, the expected by the UN Sustainable Development Goals to hit 2 by the end of the 21st century. I actually think it's going to get there a lot quicker. I would put the date at about 2070 based on kind of my rough calculations. I think we're going to hit way before then. Okay, so I mean at 2, you're then below replacement, right? So global fertility likely to go below replacement fertility sometime in the 21st century. And it could happen a lot faster than you think. Okay, so economics. Does economics work as an explanation for declining fertility, right? And generally the sort of explanation is that, raising children is expensive and difficult. And so given all of the economic challenges that people face, they choose not to have children or have children much later, thus shortening that fertility window until they've met a lot of their economic demands. So does this make sense? Well, I think there's really, really good evidence that this doesn't make sense, right? And that actually economics is overstated as a cause of declining fertility. And we can look at a few examples of this, right? Hungary is probably the most interesting one because Hungary, under Viktor Orban, right? So love him or hate him. A lot of people hate him. He's been Hungarian prime minister for quite a while now. One of the things that Orban has pushed very, very hard in Hungary is trying to get fertility up, right? Because Hungary is a very small country, right? Hungarians are a very, very small population. And so with a low fertility rate, and I think their fertility rate today is about 1.56 children per woman, that means, somewhere probably 80 to 100 years hence, that population is going to half, roughly. And then, out from there, essentially Hungarians disappear as a culture and an ethnicity within kind of 200, 250 years, right? Which I know seems like a long time, but in historical context is really not. So Orban and his government have been really, really focused on trying to raise fertility. And Hungary spends nearly 5% of its GDP on fertility drives. And in all sorts of forms, like some of it is just cash, right? They've tried sort of cash for babies, right? Like you had a baby, here's some money. Like they don't buy the baby, you get to keep the baby and they give you money, right? So they're not actually trading it, but you have a baby, they give you money, and tax breaks. And their most recent one, which was announced last year, I guess in 2025, was that mothers of 3 children or more never pay income tax, right? So they are exempt for their lifetime from paying income tax, right? So yeah, it's about 5% of the total GDP of Hungary, which is more than Hungary spends on defense, despite the fact that they border Ukraine and Russia's really, really close by, right? So they live in a, shall we say, a rough neighborhood. They spend more on fertility drives than on defense, and large parts of Hungary's budget deficits seem to be driven by how much they spend on attempting to raise fertility. And yeah, it remains pretty low. Like what seems to happen is that when they announce a new program, fertility jumps for a few years before essentially dropping back down to baseline, but never getting close to replacement fertility. So, they could spend more money, but, it doesn't seem to have much effect to begin with. Okay, and other countries like Sweden and Norway give really generous parental leave benefits, right? They have super supported social welfare networks that give parents a lot of support, low-cost childcare, long periods of parental leave that can be taken by either parent, right? I think it's as much as 2 years in Sweden, and yet it seems that it has had basically no effect. The Scandinavian countries have some of the lowest fertility on Earth, despite having among the highest levels of benefits. Yeah, okay, hang on. I have 1 minute. I don't have time to do religiosity, but let's pick it up there. Platonic roommates? No, it does not. No, not roommates. Roommates don't count. Like, you live with your boo. That's what I'm saying. You meet that person, their lease comes up, you decide to move in together to save on rent. That. More money equals better relations. Wow, oh, I cleared that comment. I'm sorry. Next time. Goodbye. Please retype your comment. I forgot to answer it, and there is a go back arrow. I don't know if it's too late. What have I done? No, I closed it, so it probably won't let me go back. I've destroyed everything. All right, well, another time. Retype your comment for next time.